It's January 22nd, 1879. Isandlwana, Southern Africa. Since dawn, unsettling reports have been reaching the British encampment. Unusual movements have been noticed on the hills nearby, with the figures of Zulu warriors appearing and disappearing. But then, the warnings feel too vague to provoke a real alarm on the side of the British Army. The danger is underestimated. The camp remains exposed. Then, without warning, the valley explodes. A force of thousands of Zulu warriors surges forward, swift, coordinated, and execute a formation no European officers witnessed before. The British firing lines stretch thin. Their superior weapons prove useless against a maneuver designed to outpace, outflank, and overwhelm. The situation is dire. Within minutes, the situation collapses. It's too late to retreat. The encirclement of the British camp by Zulu warriors is complete. By the end of that afternoon of 22nd January 1879, more than 1,300 British and Allied soldiers, including their commander, Colonel Henry Pauline, lay dead. An army camp that had believed itself invincible had been destroyed. It remains one of the most shocking defeats of a European imperial army by African warriors in the 19th century. And this was only one of the countless battles triggered by a rush by European powers in the late 18th and early 19th centuries to move into Africa and carve for themselves territories, obtain raw materials, and create markets for their goods, while imposing a new system of administration. The historians call this rush the Scramble and Partition of Africa. So what forces were truly set in motion by that rush? What European systems took root? What resistances rose against them? And how do the borders that were drawn during that scramble still shape the fate of Africa today? In the late 1884, representatives of the major European powers gathered in Berlin. Their task was simple: to prevent European war among themselves over African territories. The conference ended with them agreeing on how Africa would be taken and divided amongst themselves. By early 1885, they had written rules to govern and guide the occupation and partition of the African continent without them clashing. The first was that a claim by European power over an African territory meant nothing unless it was fully backed by effective occupation. This meant that a European nation that claimed a territory in Africa had to prove it by showing that they physically occupied the territory, with forts and administrative units established and treaties signed with the territory's native leaders. Lack of those conditions meant the territory was not occupied, and any European power could still claim it for its flag. The second rule opened Africa's great river channels, thereby granting their access to all European powers for navigation and exploration. This significantly removed the last natural barriers that had slowed European powers' advancement in the African interior. The third required every new seizure of territory to be reported to other European powers, a system meant to keep European order while each power secured a share of the African continent for itself. Worth noting is that when they established these rules, no African leader had been invited. The drafting was done overseas, abroad, far, far from the African continent. In fact, no African alive then in Africa would know the Berlin Conference or the decision by European powers to divide the continent amongst themselves until years later, when the information would be first published in history books. In February of 1885, when the Berlin Conference ended, Africa was officially opened up for European invasion and dominance. Immediately, European agents rushed inland. From 1885 onward, treaties were hurriedly scribbled and pushed across kingdoms and chiefdoms. Treaties that many African leaders misunderstood, as they were primarily designed to create a paper trail to justify the African land grab by European imperialists. By mid-1880s, forts, posts, and military stations began rising far from the coasts and ocean shorelines, deep in the interior of Africa. Each European establishment became a marker, a signal to the rest of Europe. We were here first, and this is ours. Germany pressed into Southwest Africa, capturing Cameroon and Togoland. France surged deeper into West Africa, towards the Niger. Britain expanded from its coastal bases into the interior of Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, Zimbabwe, and South Africa, while Portugal rushed to secure its remaining ambitions by pushing inland from Angola and Mozambique as it attempted to link its colonies across southern Africa, a vision symbolized by a proposed pink map, a bold Portuguese plan to create a continuous empire from coast to coast, one that would ignite a major diplomatic confrontation with Britain. As flags advanced across the interior of Africa, diplomats in Europe began drawing borders, straight lines, curves, sharp angles, boundaries that completely ignored every living reality of African communities on the ground. By the 1890s, the final phase of the scramble was underway. Whatever remained unclaimed was seized quickly, really quickly. Britain and France settled their rivalries. Italy pushed into the Horn of Africa, and small ambitions collapsed under larger ones. By the dawn of the 20th century, nearly 90% of Africa lay under European control. Only Ethiopia remained independent and unconquered. And Liberia, as it had a protected status created by the American colonization without any true sovereignty, also remained unoccupied. But beneath the partition and scramble of Africa, something far more urgent stirred. The real test was no longer the show of ability to claim African territories. The colonies the Europeans had taken now had to be kept and had to be ruled. In this regard, European powers were quickly learning that this would not be easy. Some territories could not just be taken easily and kept at all. And this exposed problems far greater than anything anticipated during the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 85. So, as European rule began to take form across most of Africa by the early 1890s, European imperialists found themselves amid mounting challenges and pressures, all to do with claiming and governing vast African territories as colonies. With that in mind, each European empire had to devise systems and strategies through which it could administer and retain control over its colonies in its own European image. In this regard, Britain elected to apply the indirect system of rule, with this system being first developed and tested in practice in northern Nigeria, British colony. under Lord Frederick Lugard in the 1890s. It was then systematically refined, rehearsed, and exported to other areas under the British flag, with minor adjustments depending on the local establishments of a given African territory. Under indirect system of rule, the British would position traditional leaders as native authorities, tasked with minor but very crucial administrative roles like collection of taxes, enforcement of new laws on natives, and perpetuating a new way of doing things that did not originally exist in a given area. This system was effective for the British occupation in the areas they administered control over. Dare say, almost elegant. However, beneath its colonizing surface, it dismantled African communal and customary systems, hardened African identities, deepened existing divisions between African societies and cultures, and forced societies into rigid administrative units and blocks. For the French African colonies, France chose a different path, quite the opposite of the indirect rule system applied by the British. It was the direct rule and assimilation system. Under the direct rule and assimilation system, the French totally undermined and disregarded the existing African governance structures and rather imposed a highly centralized administrative structure run directly by the French officials. With this direct rule and assimilation system, the goal of France was to absorb its African colonies into the French Republic itself, to transform Africans into French subjects in language, law, culture, and loyalty, with schools being set up to mainly teach French ideals. In theory, Africans in French colonies could become French citizens if they fully adopted French language, culture, laws, and customs. However, in reality, this promise applied only to a very small elite class, while the vast majority of Africans only remained colonial subjects rather than full French citizens. With this system of direct rule and assimilation, the French imperialists demanded of their colonial subjects a total cultural surrender. The system reached at the root of African language, belief, and identity, driving a wedge between those who would adapt and those who would resist. Where the British and French applied indirect and direct rule, elsewhere, European control took on forms that could only grow harsher and darker. In the Congo Free State under Leopold II, between 1895 and 1908, what emerged was not a conventional colonial administration, but a brutal system of direct personal rule built almost entirely around extraction and terror. Nothing in the Congo Free State, as they called it, was truly free. The Congo became the darkest experiment of colonial rule in Africa. Forced labor, amputation of Congolese, hostage taking, and mass killings became the norm across the Congo. Some Congolese communities were entirely raised in the pursuit of rubber and profit. To date, historians are yet to agree on an exact number, but it is generally estimated that between 8 and 10 million Congolese died under Leopold II's rule due to forced labor, starvation, brutal punishments, and displacement. In German Southwest Africa, modern-day Namibia, between 1904 and 1908, what emerged was a brutal system of direct military rule and settler colonialism. Under this system, the Herero people of central Namibia and the Nama communities of the southern regions were driven to the brink of extinction. Under the orders of General Lothar von Trotha, German commanders issued extermination orders. Those with the daring luck to survive were chased down into the deserts of Namibia, where death still surely awaited them. And for those Africans that remained, were forced into camps and subjected to hard labor. It was genocide, one of the earliest in Africa in the modern era. Further southeast in Angola and Mozambique, the Portuguese applied a coercive system of direct rule. This Portuguese system was built around rigid racial hierarchies and compulsory labor systems that were imposed by both the Portuguese colonial state and private Portuguese settlers. Through this coercive system of direct rule, Africans were legally divided into inferior racial categories, and African labor was forcefully turned into the driving force behind the Portuguese plantations, mining operations, and export industries in Angola and Mozambique. Entire communities were uprooted from their lands. Families were separated through forced labor recruitment. Famine and disease spread across the overworked populations, and countless of Africans died under brutal, very brutal labor conditions. With these varying systems of rule in place by European imperialists in African colonies, which all hinged on exploitation and overworking of Africans, railway systems soon sprang up across the continent, cutting through landscapes and African landforms. These railways were not designed to connect African societies, but rather to funnel resources toward European ships waiting along the coasts, bound for Europe at the expense of divided and collapsing African societies. Colonial rule in application introduced not only harsh labor demands, but also very oppressive taxation systems and foreign laws, all pressing deeply into the daily and lived experiences of African communities for the benefit of European ever-growing economies. And so, by the beginning of the 20th century, clearly, each European power with a stake in Africa had defined their system of rule. But even then, colonial rule of African communities was far, far from secure. To the surprise of European empires, with all their military might, war experience, and superior armory, Africans resisted, confronting European forces with war strategies, formations, and a resolve that many European armies had never encountered. Very fast, European imperialist regimes had to confront the truth that colonization of Africa was never going to be without a fight. In fact, African resistance against Europeans had begun long before the Scramble and Partition of Africa itself. These resistances emerged as early as the late 18th century along the coasts, where Europeans first attempted to establish trading posts. And so, as colonial powers began to push and campaign for permanent rule over African territories, these resistances only intensified, becoming more organized, more focused on driving European occupation out of Africa entirely. To debunk the myth of effortless European conquest of Africa, it is very important to note that throughout the colonial period, enormous time and resources were spent by Europeans suppressing African rebellions, many of which escalated into prolonged wars lasting years rather than months. One of the earliest and most stunning examples of resistance came from this powerful Zulu kingdom in southern Africa. Just before the full scramble and invasion of the African continent. In January 1879, the Zulu kingdom under King Cetshwayo confronted the expanding British Empire head-on after British forces had invaded Zululand in an attempt to break Zulu independence. The British, given the might of their army and weaponry, they had marched upon the Zulu grounds, expecting a swift victory. But the Zulu warriors resisted openly. Using disciplined formations, speed, and deep knowledge of the terrain, they pushed British forces to the brink. And at the Battle of Isandlwana on the 22nd of January 1879, in a single afternoon, the Zulu army overwhelmed a modern, well-equipped British force, killing more than 1,000 British soldiers, including their commander, Colonel Henry Pauline. It was one of the worst defeats Britain had suffered in the colonial war, and Europe was stunned. Just 2 years later, in June 1881, another resistance erupted in Sudan against the Egyptian rule that was fully backed by the British Army imperial power. This Sudan uprising was led by Muhammad Ahmad, a respected Islamic teacher, Sufi leader, and holy man, who had already built a strong religious following across Sudan. In the uprising, Muhammad Ahmad proclaimed himself the Mahdi, referring to a messianic figure sent by Allah to restore justice to the Sudanese people, purify Islam in the land, and lead Sudanese faithfuls against corruption, foreign domination that was being perpetuated by the Egyptians with the help of British forces. What followed became known as the Mahdist Rebellion. The rebellion disrupted colonial administration, cut supply routes, and defeated successive expeditions that were mounted by the British against it. In 1885, the Mahdist forces captured Khartoum, the capital of Sudan, killing British General Charles Gordon, who had been sent to organize the evacuation and the defense of the city. Having seized the city, the Mahdist Rebellion under their leader Muhammad Ahmad established an independent Mahdist state that would endure for 13 years until 1898. It took a massive Anglo-Egyptian army, modern artillery, and years of campaigning to defeat the Mahdist Rebellion in 1898. In West Africa, the French expansion made its own share of sustained African resistance under Samori Touré. Samori Touré was a powerful West African ruler, military commander, trader, and founder of the Wassulo Empire. By the time the French expansion reached his territories, he had already governed a large empire with a disciplined standing army created to defend and expand his own state, trade networks across the region. From 1882 to 1898, Samori transformed his forces into a highly mobile army that directly challenged French ambitions through rapid movement, shifting bases, and prolonged guerrilla-style warfare. In doing so, Samori reorganized his army, secured modern firearms through trade, shifted capitals when threatened, and employed scorched earth tactics to deny the French supplies. For 16 years, French forces were drawn into an exhausting war that drained manpower, resources, and prestige before Samori Touré was finally captured. Elsewhere, in the Horn, where the French struggled in West Africa against Samori Touré and his forces, and the British were struggling with the Mahdist rebellion in Sudan, Italy faced a very fierce resistance in Ethiopia. In 1896, Italy attempted to turn Ethiopia into its own protectorate. Emperor Menelik II of Ethiopia then stood his ground and mobilized a vast multi-ethnic army, secured modern weapons through diplomacy with rival European powers such as France and Russia, and then drew the Italian forces deep into the Ethiopian rugged highlands. In those highlands, at the decisive Battle of Adwa on the 1st March of 1896, Ethiopian troops crushed the Italian army so completely that Italy was forced to abandon all its colonial ambitions in Ethiopia and retreat to other areas. No European power had anticipated such a decisive defeat, and no European power would ever attempt to colonize Ethiopia again. Across Africa and the Black diaspora, Adwa became proof that colonial Europe could be stopped. Resistances continued wherever European powers sought control. In 1900, in the British Gold Coast, colonial authorities demanded the golden stool, a sacred symbol of Asante's sovereignty. Led by Yaa Asantewaa, Asante forces rose in armed rebellion. They disrupted British administration and laid siege to colonial positions for months. Yes, in the end, Britain prevailed, but only after deploying reinforcements from across the empire. But the uprising became a lasting symbol of cultural and political defiance to the Asante people and their neighbors. In 1905, German rule in Africa faced its greatest challenge, the Maji-Maji Rebellion, a resistance movement heavily inspired and spiritually unified by King Ngwale, a respected spiritual medium and healer from southern Tanzania. Dozens of communities came together and united against forced labor, extensive taxation, and brutality by the German regime. Guided by their shared spiritual beliefs, they attacked plantations and outposts, rapidly disrupting colonial rule. Germany responded with overwhelming force, destroying crops, burning villages, and inducing famine. By 1907, the rebellion was crushed, but at a catastrophic human cost. These and many other African resistances shocked European powers who had expected an easy takeover. Resistances delayed conquest, drained resources, disrupted colonial administration, and forced empires to rethink how Africa could be ruled. What Europe had imagined would be a swift and orderly division in their campaign of Scramble and Partition of Africa became a prolonged struggle marked by war, improvisation, and fear. Across Africa, resistances endured through revolt, religion, and memory, refusing to let colonial rule settle quietly. By the dawn of the 20th century, yes, Europe had conquered, but its rule remained fragile and heavily contested by Africans. Every system of control had provoked resistance. Every act of domination had produced defiance by Africans. However, despite these pressures, European rule was on the verge of carving something far more sinister, lasting into Africa's future. Borders, straight and jagged lines were being drawn across ancient homelands, dividing communities, severing ethnic ties. and ignoring African history just for European convenience at an enormous cultural cost. And by the closing years of the 19th century, those lines had begun hardening into permanent political realities of African communities that were once as one. Across the continent, peoples who had once traded together, migrated together, fought together, intermarried each other, and shared histories stretching back centuries, suddenly found themselves separated by foreign frontiers they had never agreed to and had never been consulted about. A case in point, the Somali people of the Horn of Africa. The Somali people located in East Africa for centuries occupied a vast continuous region stretching across the Somali Peninsula. At the arrival of European imperialists during the Scramble and Partition of Africa, they were in the late 1880s and early 1900s gradually divided between the British, Italians, French, and the expanding Ethiopian Empire. With those divisions, the Great Somali Peninsula ended in small identical groupings named after their colonizers, the British Somaliland in the present-day Somaliland region of northern Somalia, Italian Somaliland in the present-day southern and central Somalia, French Somaliland in the present-day Djibouti, the Ogaden region under Ethiopia, and the northern frontier district under British Kenya, today part of northern Kenya. Communities that had once shared kinship ties, grazing lands, trade routes, language, and religious life suddenly found themselves separated by colonial frontiers and administered under entirely different political systems. This fragmentation fractured Somali nationalism and would later fuel border disputes and repeated struggles in modern-day Africa to unify Somali inhabited territories. As a result of jagged boundaries drawn here and there across African societies in the Sahara and the Sahel regions, caravan routes and long-established trading networks that had once connected societies for generations were now interrupted by checkpoints, customs posts, and colonial administrations limiting the free movement of Africans from location to location, a freedom they had enjoyed for centuries. And these divisions did not stop at boundaries. As the 1890s gave way to the early 20th century, European imperialists increasingly began constructing entirely artificial colonial states, merging together African peoples with different political systems, languages, religions, and histories into single colonial territories designed primarily for administrative convenience, exploitation, and extraction. In West Africa, between the late 1890s and 1914, the British gradually consolidated hundreds of communities and kingdoms into what is today known as modern-day Nigeria, culminating into the formal amalgamation of northern and southern Nigeria in 1914. Hausa-Fulani Emirates in the north, Yoruba kingdoms in the southwest, Igbo societies in the southeast, and numerous other peoples were all brought under one colonial administration, despite possessing entirely different political traditions, religious systems, and social structures. Outside of Nigeria, still in West African region, between 1890s and early 1900s, the French joined vast stretches of land and West African communities into a centralized federation known as French West Africa, governed from Dakar in present-day Senegal. Territories that form modern-day Senegal, Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea, Niger, Benin, Ivory Coast, and Mauritius were gradually drawn together into a single colonial administrative structure controlled by the French. Just like in West Africa and the story of Somaliland in East Africa, so was Central Africa. Colonial boundaries cutting through kingdoms and communities, and at no time was there regard for the effects this could have on African societies and relationship ties that had existed between African communities for centuries. Africa's image and communal realities had been altered and were now reorganized and run around European administrative logic and economic interests. And to maintain these colonial territories, European powers had to move quickly to deepen and entrench their systems of administration. So, by the early 1900s, colonial rule had become more than a military occupation and transfigured into entire governing structures. Under British indirected rule, selected chiefs were transformed into native authorities responsible for collecting taxes, enforcing colonial regulations, recruiting labor, and administering colonial directives on behalf of the British imperialist empire. And in many communities, African leaders who resisted were removed, while those willing to cooperate were elevated and empowered. Colonial administrators increasingly categorized Africans into rigid tribal and ethnic classifications. Communities that had once possessed fluid identities and overlapping alliances were now boxed into administrative units, census categories, and territorial districts. All this with the same objective: consolidation of European imperial rule in Africa. In the French colonies, assimilation policies expanded into schools, court systems, and bureaucracies, with a deliberate design of replacing African political and cultural systems with French institutions and ideals. By the 1920s and 1930s, colonial systems had penetrated deeply into the everyday life of African societies, with foreign laws governing Africans and determining their way of life. Colonial taxation shaping African labor, European court systems increasingly overruling African customs in favor of European customs, colonial governors presiding over African chiefs and kings and councils that had once exercised independent authority. And while Africa's political structures were being reorganized, its economies were also increasingly being adjusted and redirected outward toward European interests. This economic shift began in the early 20th century onward, as colonial infrastructure like railway lines cutting through forests, valleys, and deserts, roads pushing deep into mining zones and plantation regions, and ports expanding along the Atlantic and Indian Ocean coasts, all spread rapidly across the continent. These systems and infrastructures were not designed to connect African societies, rather to move African wealth outward. Rubber from the Congo, copper from Central Africa, gold and diamonds from Southern Africa, cocoa from the Gold Coast, cotton from Egypt and Sudan, palm oil from Nigeria, and many valuable products and minerals all destined for Europe. This meant reorganizing entire African economies around export dependence. Subsistence farming, practiced by Africans for centuries, meant to take care of African households and communities, steadily gave way to cash crop production, controlled by colonial demands and international markets, with prices dictated by European middle companies. These new economic realities saw Africa slowly become a somewhat production machine driven by hard labor systems, taxation policies that compelled Africans to work on colonial and settler plantations, and in many cases, entire communities were relocated in favor of mines, plantations, railways, and other settler enterprises. But economic restructuring was not all. Alongside the economic restructuring was social restructuring as well. In the early decades of the 20th century, colonial rule deliberately began reshaping how Africans thought and saw themselves. This was with the help of mission schools, which favored European languages, European histories, European religious teachings, and European political values at the expense of African belief systems, institutions, histories, customs, and languages. African ideals were dismissed as primitive or backward. Colonial education increasingly rewarded those Africans that adapted themselves to European systems, while alienating and despising those who dared to stick to their own cultural foundations. This social restructuring led to the emergence of new African colonial elites educated within colonial institutions, fluent in European languages, and trained to operate inside the systems created by imperial rule. Part of social restructuring was introduction of classification of Africans by colonial regimes. Across many parts of the continent, colonial governments introduced colonial identity cards, tribal classifications, racial hierarchies, and administrative divisions to deliberately and steadily harden social boundaries and tribal and class identities that had once been more fluid and navigable by Africans. In Rwanda, for instance, located in the Great Lakes region of East Central Africa, the Belgian colonial administration from the 1920s and 1930s onward increasingly elevated and racialized distinctions between the Hutu and the Tutsi. These two groups had historically functioned more as fluid and social and economic classes within Rwandan kingdom rather than as rigid ethnic communities. Through censuses, issuance of identity cards, and administrative policies, Belgian authorities transformed and hardened these flexible social categories into rigid ethnic and political groupings. The Belgian administration increasingly favored many Tutsi elites in education, administration, and colonial governance, while marginalizing many Hutu communities, deepening resentment and inequality, whose consequences would later become catastrophic in post-colonial Rwanda. And so, with the political, social, and economic restructuring, by the 1940s and 1950s, Africa had been profoundly transformed. By and large, the European colonial powers had succeeded in conquering the continent militarily, and in doing so, they had deliberately created new African societies with the help of colonial borders, driven and sustained on colonial economies and colonial administrations and colonial identities. However, at the same time, starting in the 1940s and 1950s, new winds began to rise of a new African political consciousness comprised of educated African elites, trade unionists, veterans returning from world wars, student forums, and Pan-African thinkers who would increasingly demand for self-rule and independence of those new African societies that had been created in the wake of Scramble and Partition of Africa by European imperialists. And from North Africa to the South Africa, from West Africa to the East, all African anti-colonial movements gathered momentum. The very schools and systems created by colonial governments had unintentionally produced generations of Africans now demanding for freedom. And by the late 1950s and the early 1960s, colonial rule across much of Africa began collapsing, one after another, African nations obtaining independence. But these winds of independence arrived carrying painful realities. The superficial colonial borders would remain, and they remained. With these new colonial states remaining, meant the administrative colonial systems would remain, which by and large favored European ways of political governance, laws, cultural beliefs, ways of thinking, and export economies, which produced raw materials mainly for the satisfaction of European factories, with Africa only serving as a market to finished goods arriving back from Europe. Worse, however, was that many of the internal political tensions between new African groupings created during the colonial rule also would remain, that would see Africa slide into a period of civil wars and turmoil immediately after independence. In 1963, newly independent African states would come together, form the Organization of African Union. These new African leaders and their newly formed organization faced a dangerous dilemma, a question: should the colonial borders be erased and redrawn? The dilemma was extremely difficult. By independence, colonial borders had already become deeply embedded into administrative unit systems, transport networks, economies, state institutions, and African political life itself. Many African communities were also now heavily intermixed across these new territories. For many African leaders, attempting to redraw borders along ethnic, linguistic, religious, and historical lines risked triggering competing territorial claims and wide instability across the continent. And so, in 1964, African leaders made a historic and deeply consequential decision. They agreed to preserve the colonial boundaries as were drawn by colonial imperialists and were inherited at independence. And with that decision, these lines first sketched in European capitals during the late 19th century became the permanent political map of the modern-day Africa. Europe had left, yet its shadow still loomed large over Africa. The continent had inherited the borders drawn in European capitals, the colonial political systems, foreign laws, export economies, imposed identities, racial and tribal classifications, and institutions that had been created during the Scramble and Partition of Africa. Much of modern Africa would now move forward into these structures originally designed not for African realities, but for European imperial interests. And in the decades that followed independence, the consequences of those borders and colonial structures would continue unfolding across the African continent. In West Africa, Nigeria, the giant colonial state created by the British in 1914 would descend into Biafran War between 1967 and 1970, as political and ethnic tensions inherited from colonial rule exploded into a big civil war, a conflict that would claim an estimated number of up to 3 million lives, mainly through famine, disease, and starvation. In the Horn of Africa, Somalia would repeatedly clash with Ethiopia over Somali inhabited territories during the Scramble and Partition of Africa. In the Central Africa, the Congo, one of the richest regions on earth in mineral wealth, would endure decades of coups, rebellions, foreign interventions, and political instability following the collapse of Belgian colonial rule. Since independence in 1960, successive conflicts in the Congo and the wider Great Lakes region have contributed to the death of millions of Congolese through warfare, displacement, famine, disease, making it one of the deadliest prolonged crises in modern Africa. And in Rwanda, where colonial administrators had hardened social classifications into rigid political and ethnic divisions, tensions would eventually erupt into one of the most devastating genocide in the modern era in 1994. The borders first discussed in European capitals in the late 19th century had now become real political realities carrying real human consequences. And yet, despite these realities, Africa's story did not end with colonialism. Just as African societies had resisted conquest during the Scramble and Partition of Africa, new generations of Africans would continue resisting the long shadow left behind by colonial rule. From the second half of the 20th century onward, calls increasingly emerged for greater African unity, African self-determination, and African solutions for African problems. Pan-African movements and thinkers such as Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, Patrice Lumumba of the Congo, and Muammar Gaddafi of Libya argued at different times that many of the divisions inherited from colonial rule could only be truly overcome through stronger African cooperation, regional integration, and economic independence. Across the continent, efforts gradually began emerging to reconnect African economies, African societies, and African political interests that had once been divided during the scramble. In East Africa, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, South Sudan, Somalia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo have increasingly pursued closer regional cooperation through the East African Community, a regional bloc whose member states over the years have signed and assented to frameworks and protocols establishing custom unions, common markets, freer movement of East African citizens, and long-term proposals for future East African political federation and a shared political regional structure. Beyond East Africa, the African Continent Free Trade Area launched officially in 2021 under the African Union, which seeks to reduce trade barriers across the continent and expand the free movement of African goods, services, and markets across borders that had originally been designed during the colonial partition. Vis-a-vis travel agreements, continental railway projects, cross-border infrastructure programs, and growing calls for African-led development increasingly reflect a broader desire to reduce dependence on external powers and rebuild an African system around African priorities. And so, more than a century after the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, Africa still continues to wrestle with the inheritance of the scramble and partition of Africa. The men who gathered in Berlin are long gone. Their empires collapsed, their flags lowered on African grounds, but many of the borders they drew remain. The political systems remain, the economic structures remain, the institutions remain, and in many ways the debate over African unity, African identity, African development, and African self-determination continues unfolding within realities first shaped during that scramble. On the 22nd of January 1879, at Isandlwana, where the Zulu warriors overwhelmed the British camp, they could not have imagined that the struggle unfolding before them was part of something far larger that would reshape nearly the entire African continent. But from the battlefields of Isandlwana to the conference halls of Berlin, from colonial borders to modern-day African unions, the scramble and partition of Africa will leave a legacy that still stretches across the continent.